I happened to have it in my car.
Oh, wow.
Because I was getting it fixed. So if that works.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'll just let you find your seats before I begin. So hello, my name is Daniel Bear, and I'm an event facilitator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 territory, and that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Innuit, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Additionally, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. Tonight, we welcome Nora Loreto to the city to celebrate the Winnipeg launch of the Social Safety Net, Canada in Decline, Part 1, published by Dundurn Press. Loreto's latest tracks the 40-year attack on Canada's social safety net and outlines the choices we need to make, as well as the possible paths forward to fix all that is crumbling around us. Nora will be up to discuss the book, and then welcome questions and conversation from the audience, in which, if you are feeling comfortable, you can come over to the front and just have a seat right next to Nora to ask your questions and have a discussion. Just keep in mind, we are doing a live stream. So in the case that you are not okay being on camera, there's no worries. I have the wireless microphone here. Just raise your hand and I'll come running by from the back just to give you the microphone. And I will be back at the end to review signing procedures, but for now, we have the pleasure of introducing tonight's guest. Nora Loreto is a freelance writer and editor at the Canadian Association of Labour Media. She co-hosts the popular political podcast, Sandy and Nora Talk Politics. The author of 4 books, Nora lives in Quebec City, and please join me in welcoming Nora Loreto.
Wow, there's the microphone. Hi, everybody. How are you? It's Saturday night. I feel like we should be in a bar or a weird church or something. I don't know what people do on Saturdays anymore. It is so wonderful to be here. And I gotta say, this chair is like really comfortable, so I don't have to go anywhere for the next 5 hours. So I hope that you're all ready for an odyssey of politics and political talk. And if you're the rest of the store and you're wondering what the heck's going on, come and sit, because we're gonna do some really crazy things tonight. Really, yeah, just come and sit. It's gonna be great. I'm just seeing people walk in. I don't know who they are. All right. Yeah, so first to just explain, I asked a couple of folks who wanted to maybe come and co-host, and everyone's burnt out and tired. And so you will be interviewing me tonight. And instead of maybe interviewing me, I figure anytime, if you want to come up here when I finish my opening remarks, you'll have a conversation. So we'll maybe have a couple of backs and forths, and then you can give the seat to someone else to have that opportunity, okay? So the Social Safety Net, it is volume 1 of a series called Canada in Decline. A certain national bookseller thought that was too negative and asked us to change the title. We said, no. But it is depressing, and so I'm gonna hopefully depress you tonight with humor and with levity, reminding myself and reminding all of us that the issues that we face are severe and they're dangerous and they cost people's lives, and they're not funny. But when you're talking about things that are deeply not funny, I have to do it with humor, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to talk about it at all. So don't mistake the jokes for any comment on what I think about the social state of the world right now. It is book 1. Book 2 is done and coming out in May. And I'm gonna talk, I'm realizing as I get older, my memory is definitely getting worse. And so that's probably not very great. I'm not sure I remember what I wrote in this book. And so a lot of what I talk about might be about the next book. I approached Dundurn to write a series on the decline of Canada, and they were like, no one's gonna read a book that's longer than 60,000 words. And I had just done the book about COVID that I wrote, and if you read that book or listened to that book, you'll know that it took you 24 hours to listen to it. It took me 1 month to record it. Never doing that again. And it was 135,000 words, okay, to give you an idea. That's a heavy book. It was a long book. And this, we said, look, we're gonna do this in a series. And so this is on the collapse of the social safety net. It sets the table of what we're going to talk about in the rest of the series. And the next book is about the corporate control of Canada. This is the book with the solutions. The rest of the books have no solutions. I mean, the solutions are, let's just stop doing what we're doing, right? Let's maybe change what we're doing. And I gotta say, you know, I don't blame immigrants on all of our problems. I don't blame migrants on our problems, or drug users, or unhoused people, or anyone else in society who's marginalized. I don't blame queer people or trans people on all of our problems. And no one's interviewed me in the mainstream press. Not one interview, not one review in all of Canada since this book has come out in August. Never, this is my 4th book, I've never had that experience before. And it tells me that the establishment in this country is scared to bits of the actual solutions that we need. They're scared because they know that average people don't actually want to blame marginalized people on our problems. That we actually need a narrative that explains why everything's collapsing, that doesn't blame it on marginalized people. So that's really tough, because we've got to talk about these things then in alternative forums. Book events like this are wonderful. The book was the top seller for nonfiction books in independent bookstores in Canada in the month of September, which is like crazy. I can't believe it. I'm like, oh my God, you read my books? Thank you. And I think it is so important for us to say the track that we are on in this country is leading to disaster. And I'm not saying anything that you probably are going to be surprised by. It is leading to disaster. It is leading to a situation where the gap between the rich and the poor in this country, it has never been bigger. Do you know what year we made the highest number of profits ever in this country? From the beginning in 1867 to today, what year did we hit the highest level of profit making? It's in 2022. And we are on track to beat that in 2024. And when you have record profits like that, that means you are stealing from the wages of average people and you're overcharging people for your services. And that combination is absolutely deadly. We see the effect of that on streets. We see the effect of that in our social services, in our day-to-day jobs. I'm sure every one of you has a job where you see some of that. And yet, we don't actually have the chance to talk about what extreme profiteering and extreme wealth does to a society. It perverts the society. It makes the society cruel. It makes it inextractable. We can't get out of these problems because we get wrapped up into the logic of profit. And we fight against, you know, with slogans like "don't privatize healthcare." And we forget that the system of privatization is not just privatizing healthcare, but it is also using the logic of the market to deliver and to fix healthcare. I'm sure some of you know what lean is. Yeah, some of you do not know what lean is. Lean is when it's a process that looks at building a car and says, if we fix a broken arm or help someone with cancer treatment, the way that we build a car, we will be able to be the most efficient possible. Right? Because we're like cars. But we're not exactly like cars. People get sick and injured in inconvenient locations in this country. You know, like the north, rural areas where it's hard to get to people. And by the logic of making a car, you'd be like, you know what, that's a waste of our money and time. They can die, it's fine. We'll be more efficient in the major centers. We'll be more efficient where there's economies of scale. You can't apply that logic to healthcare. And you can't apply that logic to the public sector, but that's happening across the entire public sector. Anybody working in the public sector knows that profit logic has seeped into it. So the social safety net, this book tracks the formation of Canada's social safety net, reminds us that the glory days of our social safety net also happened at the exact same time of the worst of the genocide committed against Indigenous people in this country. And that it wasn't by accident these things happened together, that social services in Canada have always existed as part of the colonial project. They've always existed to give white families what they need to have children, to build the economy that we've built. And the flip side of that has always been causing harm causing tremendous harm to Indigenous people. And I track that in the first 2 chapters of the book. And I think it's very important for us to think about when we talk about residential schools. It's not just residential schools, but it's actually residential schools and schools. Like these were the same system doing different things under the banner of the same reason, which was building a white Christian Canada, right? And if we don't understand that, then we can't fix the problems that exist in today's school systems, right? If we don't address the root of the problems, the systemic racism that exists within schools continues to exist, and the other kinds of systemic oppressions continue to exist. But we also have to understand at what point in history Canadians were fed the change that led us onto the track that we're on today. And I use 1980 as the year. I mean, it's not like it happens all in one year, but as the turning point from the post-war Keynesian period to the modern neoliberal period, which is where we find ourselves today. And a lot of Canadian identity is wrapped up in the idea that it was so great in the post-war period, like, you know, healthcare is part of our identity, and public services and taking care of one another. But we moved so fast beyond that post-war period that Canadians didn't even realize that it didn't exist anymore until it was so gone. And coming to terms with the fact that Canada in the post-war period is not the Canada of the 1990s, the 2000s, and the 2010s, has been very difficult for Canadians. And it creates a cognitive dissonance where we think Canada is one thing, but our experiences show us that Canada is a completely different thing. And that's really hard to wrap your heads around because we're living in myth. We're like such dreamy people. I mean, now living in Quebec, and say Quebecers are really dreamy people. But so like English Canadians like to dream, but Quebecers really like to dream. You know, like the Nordiques are coming back. Like they're not, right? But you can get elected still by saying that in Quebec City. Actually, you can get elected in Quebec, the province, by saying that still. So what happens in the 1980s? The Keynesian welfare state, which grows out of tremendous depth and horrific experiences in the 2 world wars and a depression and the Spanish flu, and Canadians are kind of fed up with like death. You know, like this sucks. It sucks to be poor all the time. It sucks to not have a place to live. It sucks that families are living in tents, that people are returning from the war and there's nowhere for them to live. And we have radical socialist and communist organizing that's pushing the mainstream parties to actually do something about all of this. Tommy Douglas gets elected in Saskatchewan, freaks the Conservatives and Liberals right out. The CCF becomes the 2nd place party in the Ontario election in 1943, really freaks the Liberals and Conservatives out. And they start adopting the policies that are being pushed by the radical left in Canada. And that's how we start to get the social safety net, the social services that do form the foundation of what modern understanding of Canadian identity is, especially in relation to the United States. But neoliberalism was not a new thing when it was first practiced with in the 1980s. It had been a political theory that had been bouncing around from the late 1940s that was too cruel to convince people to try, given the destruction of what they had just experienced in the first 50 years of the century. And so it takes time for the economic conditions to get worse to the point where maybe neoliberalism looks like an attractive option. And so, you know, the 1980s come around and politicians have 2 choices. Either we expand the social safety net, we stop excluding racialized people from it, Indigenous people from it, and we actually give those benefits, you know, make enough space for everyone in the social safety net, or we make space for fewer people overall. And what is the principal thing that does that? Free trade. Free trade fundamentally ties Canada to global markets and outsources our sovereignty in such a way that politicians no longer can make decisions about our economy. It is imposed on us. Manufacturing is considered to be completely inefficient, and a lot of the manufacturers go, of course, overseas, and Canada gets access to 100 million people of a market, as was promised by the United States in these free trade negotiations. And free trade is being experimented with the United States. The first free trade agreement is signed with Canada and 1 other country. Does anyone know what the other country was that signed the first free trade agreement with the United States other than Canada? Just yell it out. Huh? No, Mexico. Mexico would make sense because of course it gets added in, but no. I mean, this makes sense as well too, but in a very different way. It's Israel. It's Israel. And so, and they're just showing the friendship, the economic friendship between Canada, Israel, Canada, and the United States. We're practicing free trade. And the thing that free trade does, because we've always had trade, right? Canada was always a trading nation, but what does free trade add to the list of what is traded? Services. Services had never been part of international trade, because how on earth do you trade a service? It's not really intuitive in 1980 because so much of services are based on technologies that don't exist or that are emerging in the 1980s. And services get added to the free trade agreements thanks to the lobby work of the owner of American Express in the United States. And it starts us on a path where we lose total sovereign control of our economy. And so then all of a sudden politicians are like, well, we can't fix that. We can't do anything about that. It's too far out of our hands. And then we find ourselves where we are today, where it's like, maybe we should plan the economy. And it's like, you're a Russian asset and you need to shut the hell up. It's like, okay, I guess, whoa, that's weird. You know, right down to the fact that we've got the government announcing a 21% reduction in immigration, right? So let's put off like aside the racism part of all of that, which is a big part of it. But that means that we're gonna have population degrowth for 2 years, right? You can't have degrowth in an economy that's premised on growth. Now, we can all say that premising an economy on growth is a bad idea. We actually have to do planned degrowth and blah, blah, blah. But you can't just shrink your population in an economy that requires growth. It's going to be a disaster. It's going to set us on a collision course that will probably not collide until like 2.5 years from now, if we listen to certain economists. So the neoliberal shift in Canada, free trade is the real first, is the real engine of that shift. The second major engine of that shift is monetary policy. And monetary policy was absolutely critical to get the free trade agreement to work, because if Canada didn't have harmonized inflation rates, if our dollar was too high compared to the American dollar, free trade wasn't going to work. And this is where we start seeing interest rates be what governments play with through the Bank of Canada to cause massive shocks to interest rates, which does what? It gives people who've got lots of money invested instantly more money, while poor people see their purchasing power eroded, and it is a direct wealth transfer from the poor to the rich. And it is so mundane now. I mean, it wasn't mundane in the 1980s, but it's so mundane now that that is reported on as just like, Governor of the Bank of Canada, interest rate change. As if it's like, where is the democratic part of this management of our economy? No, it is the Bank of Canada. They are the experts. We do not actually talk about democracy in this situation. Okay. The third thing that happens is that Canada does a whiplash move back to the staples, right? I'm sure there's people in this audience that love Innes's staples theory, Mel Watkins, looking at people of a certain age. No, okay. I spoke at I spoke at a Trudeau Foundation scholars event, and there was some political economy and people in the room, and they're like, yes, Harold Innes, right? She was like 26, and I was like, great, I love that. Staples theory, you know it intimately because we're Canadians. It's the theory that Canada's economy is just raw resources, is just taking things out of the ground and sending them around the world. And from the earlier days of John A. Macdonald's economic policy, right until free trade, Canada had some level of planning in the economy. It was not a planned economy, but there was, through fiscal policy and through like actually saying we want manufacturing and helping companies and whatever, subsidizing things. We had an economy that had some level of planning, not direct. It's not a planned economy, but anyway. And that was trying to fight against the fact that from the very, very start of European presence in Canada or on this land, that we were just exploiting natural resources. And there's a wonderful book that came out of a Massey lecture by Jane Jacobs in 1980, which was called A Question of Sovereignty, I think. I always got the title wrong, or Question of Separation or something like this. Has anyone read that book? It is so good, and it's so wild that that was a Massey lecture, and you read it now and you're like, that would never be allowed. And Jacobs argues in that book that that Quebec sovereignty is inevitable because there's no industries in Canada that actually support our raw materials. And she uses the example of the fishing industry here versus Norway. So in Norway, they innovated canning, they innovated like how the fish get processed and all this kind of stuff. And Canada just takes buckets of fish and sends them to other countries to do that work. And that was the 1980s. So the 1990s, there's an intentional shift back to oil and gas. And in doing that, fundamentally ties our economy back to the boom and bust cycle of the staples of oil and gas. So these three forces, and this is coming from work by Jim Stanford, who's an economist who I'm sure you all know of. This is what really solidifies neoliberal policy in Canada. And today, this is what we're dealing with. So I'll end maybe with just giving a sneak preview of the next book, because that's what a good salesman does, right? When we're looking at how controlled Canada is by the corporate world, it's really stunning. It's really, really, really stunning. And I think that the best example of this is in housing. So does anyone know the first time that the federal government was involved in housing? No, not the 70s. It was very involved in the 70s, but before. Right after World War II. Yes, before that though. There was a big event that happened that forced the federal government to get into housing. Boom! How do you know that? The Halifax explosion, that's right. Because it was considered an act of war, and the federal government obviously was going to intervene. And even from then, and you will know this, and other people in the room will likely know this as well, the way that they built housing and rebuilt housing, there was a lot of charity, like trade unions, craft unions agreed to work for without profit, and they built these houses, but they privileged the people that owned houses to get new houses, and anyone who rented couldn't get the new houses. Guess who didn't own houses and rented? The Black community in a place called Africville, where that was the Black community. And so right from the beginning of housing policy, we see systemic racism built right into it. But the Halifax explosion doesn't create any long-lasting experiments in federal housing policy. And it was after World War II that we really see the first investments in housing, some experiments that work or don't work, only a couple thousand units get built. But the real explosion happens from the 1950s to the 1970s. And housing is built on the principle of profit being removed from housing. So there's no profit on any of the building aspects of housing. And houses get built for families where you can have several kids living in it for, about $60,000 to $80,000 per house in adjusted dollars today, not then. So housing today for $60,000 to $80,000, okay? Of course, that housing now is often bought and sold for millions if you're in Vancouver or if you're in Toronto or other parts of Canada. And the federal government completely gets out of housing by the end of the 1980s, such that places like Halifax have not had any units of public housing built in 30 years. And instead, what we get in 1998 is something called a REIT. Who doesn't know what that is? Most people are not going to know what it is. Most people do know what REITs are. You are smart, because usually when I say this, people have no idea. Okay, yeah. So they create these things, the real estate income trusts. And the real estate income trust allows you to be a landlord, because haven't you always wanted to be a landlord without the peskiness of actually having to deal with tenants? I hate tenants. I just want to be a landlord. And so the real estate income trust allows you to take rent, and as long as 90% of that rent is paid out to the shareholders, you pay no taxes on it. So what does that do? That disincentivizes you from maintenance, from fixing broken windows, from doing anything, because the money's going to be paid out to shareholders and people are going to get pretty much guaranteed 5% returns unless it's a high interest return rate, and then you can expect 11% returns. Now, REITs are a menace. They own about a third of rental housing in Canada. They own a majority of low-income housing in Canada. And we have innovated housing to look like mining, where you just mine this bottomless pit of poor people who have no choice but to pay the rent. Unless, I guess the choice is where you live on the street, and that is where people are hanging between. So real estate income trusts, I mean, they exist also in long-term care, and the folks that know anything about long-term care know that the Chartwells of the world, the extended cares of the world, these are REITs, and that's also why, although I know Manitoba has a pretty good public system of long-term care, I believe, right? I'm talking about forgetting about stuff, all my COVID stuff, whoo, got it out of my mind. I probably could name the long-term care facilities in the city if this was 3 years ago, but anyway. The REITs then operate as long-term care facilities. Someone rents their unit, and as long as 90% of that money goes to the shareholders, then Chartwell's not paying any taxes, which again disincentivizes doing anything more than just collecting money and paying it out. But we hear politicians talking about the housing crisis as if this isn't one of the fundamental drivers of the housing crisis. I mean, of course, the overall driver is the commodification of housing, obviously, is a lack of pensions, is people using their houses as pensions, which is like not very smart if we want to make sure people have money to participate in the economy. Also, to say nothing about like fairness or mental health or anything like that. And we don't have any tribune to talk about this at all. We don't hear about REITs. We don't hear about expropriating these ridiculous structures to actually give people homes, to give people publicly owned or publicly managed homes. We hear about supply. We hear about, oh, there's not enough will. Politicians aren't doing enough. We need to expropriate the CBC to give people a place to live. Thanks, Pierre Poilievre. And this is replicated in finance, in insurance, and in pensions. And the financialization of all of this is what the next book is about, which is, I'm so excited for, and it's so good. But this is good too. And so I'll end there. Make sure you all buy copies, because that's what makes McNally Robinson happy, but they're not Indigo, so they won't like kill me if I don't sell copies. So thank you for that. That's really generous. And so I'm gonna end there, and I wanna see who is gonna take the hot seat. I'm gonna interview that person, actually. No, I won't. I'll be really kind. So I guess I have to say thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the book. And I also get the right to kick you out. So if you're being too long here, I'm gonna kick you out. Come, Dorothy. Oh my gosh. And so this is very exciting because we've never met.
But we have.
But we have. That's right. You'll have to probably talk right into it if you can. There you go.
Okay. So I do occupational health work, and I've read parts of your COVID book and tried to contribute to some of your list keeping along the way. And I was trying to remember what we did the OCAL webinar on.
It was on
COVID.
It was on COVID, yeah, because I did it from a bed in some Bracebridge or something like this in Ontario, yeah. So I haven't read. I bought this elsewhere. That's okay.
And another independent bookstore. And one of the first things I did was look to see if COVID was mentioned. It seems to me that it's quite possible to draw links between your COVID book, this book, and the next one.
Mm-hmm.
What are they?
Yeah, okay, so this book is pretty historical. I don't actually think like COVID maybe gets in at the end. It
gets 3 or 4 pages and 165
at the end, yeah, in the conclusion.
I didn't read it, I just looked up
No, for sure. And well, yeah, because it's how I started the conclusion. And I thought that the most important thing to mention was the combination of COVID and expanded MAID coming in at the end of 2021. And so that's how I brought this in. So COVID was a moment where we saw possibility. Like, do you remember in the earlier days where we thought like maybe we can actually make some changes here?
And people were doing things with one another. I remember Facebook groups in town of, let's go out and help people who can't go out and need groceries and booze and whatever else it was to keep them going.
Yeah, it was. I just remember those days of feeling like, where you weren't sure if you had to wash your groceries, and my partner submerged a whole bag of brown sugar that had a hole in it, and then he was
in a little bleach.
And he's like, let's just put in the freezer. We'll just have frozen wet brown sugar for as long as we need it. I think we probably still have a bag in the freezer. So I'm glad that we figured it was airborne faster than not. Though I know even that is controversial to some professionals out there. But COVID ended up being retrenchment. COVID ended up being everything that is bad with society and making it worse and justifying terrible changes, justifying terrible policy, justifying terrible shortcuts. And I think that, for me personally, I felt like I had to not think about COVID for a little bit of time, because writing the book was really intense. I wrote it in 6 months while, we were living through it. But there's been no reckoning of what that did to us anywhere.
Well, some of us have pointed out that the current government in this province promised an inquiry and are trying to see if that can happen. But for me, because of my emphasis on occupational health, I think about the fact that workers in particular, whether we're talking, people talk about long-term care and worry about the residents. Well, it was the workers that were infected and were infecting everybody else because of for all kinds of reasons. And my sort of approach to things has been that if you protected workers, then you would have protected everybody. But because of the influence of various corporations, we must keep the economy going.
Maple Leaf.
Well, Maple Leaf was one of the better meatpacking companies, at least in the research I've done.
Yeah.
But
sorry, Maple Lodge. That's my
Maple,
credit.
oh, okay.
Great. The Brandon facility with the Brandon outbreak.
Yeah. And there also was a guy who died at Granny's south of here. But Alberta had the largest outbreak, fewer deaths than they did in Colorado at a place called Greeley, where I think 8 or 9 workers actually died. But so for me, there's corporate influence in terms of the pandemic, but then the social safety net for people who got sick, especially people with long COVID these days, is not there.
Yeah, and long COVID is one of these things where it's like, it should be pretty easy to make rapid clinics. Like if we're looking for solutions, it's like, create the clinics, this is basic stuff, and people have expertise, like doctors and medical professionals have formed some level of expertise, just make the clinics. But we're so, we are so trapped in the neoliberal logic that drives all of healthcare reform, that no one is going out and doing anything like that. There are interesting advocates, and I think of in Quebec the work that Amir Kadir has done, and Nima Machouf. Amir was the co-founder and leader of Quebec Solidaire. He's also an epidemiologist who has since really dedicated his time to long COVID. So there are people that are doing this stuff. The governments are doing what governments do.
Right. And the other part about social supports, sort of social safety net that I think about with this, and I'm just wondering whether you include it in the book, is the supports that people need to get things like this air cleaner that I brought, so that schools can stay open, so that small business can stay open, so that people have what to me is safety net, a social safety net, with skills and access to supports that they need to keep going, that we need to keep the economy going, not necessarily like the economy in the way that it is.
Yeah.
But generally, you know, so that people can keep going. Do you think about social safety nets in that way as well?
So this book is a little bit more high level than that, looking at the way that it ends. Spoiler alert on the ending, is looking at the two questions of reforms versus a revolutionary approach. And so in that sense, I mean, I don't get that granular because we can talk about every single sector in that way. But I make the argument that we can keep talking about reforms. Reforms are fine. They're a dead end if we don't fix the most fundamental part of our problems. And to do that, we need to be courageous and we need to name the problems as they are. And unfortunately, like we need to convince, or I don't know what, create mainstream expressions of these kinds of politics because we're just so flattering. So,
And I would add, we need to be creative.
and creative, yes. Thank you. I mean, the creativity's right here with a portable filter. It's amazing.
Okay,
And it's Canadian.
and it's Canadian.
Hi.
Okay, so bear with me while I get my thoughts. So one thing that you talked about was how the rise of all these social networks were a push from socialists and communists that were after World War II, after these major wars and the Spanish flu, people were done with suffering, right? And pushing that. And I found lately that I feel like there's such a rise in like neo-Nazi, white supremacy, fascist ideas, and with the new revelation that other countries have been influencing our government and even paying influencers in Canada to push their narratives on us, right? I also read a new study about how I think it happened after World War II. I don't know if anybody else knows this, but it was like if people were info dumped information consistently for 2 months straight, that they developed such a strong belief system in it that nothing you could do would convince them that what they were told was actually lies. And I feel like with finding out the influence of other countries, and I feel like the rage of people against socialism and the ideals around socialism are so strong and they're so loud that do you have any solutions or ideas about this and how can we reframe our thinking to get people to understand that, hey, we need these social networks in order to strive as a community, especially when people that, could rely on these are so opposed and against supporting socialist ideas.
One of the things that I think a lot about is how we no longer have a common basis of understanding each other.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you read the Free Press this morning.
No.
I did not read the Free Press this morning either. And 30 years ago, I bet you we both had.
Yeah, absolutely.
And had we both read the Free Press this morning, we both know the news that we saw. And we both know that this is the big news of the day, this is the minor news, this was going on in Ottawa. There's a columnist that we both thought was good. There's a columnist that you loved and I didn't. We talked about it. There's no common anything anymore. And I don't know if you're on Facebook. I don't know if you're on Instagram. I don't even understand Instagram. So even if you are, that means nothing to me. And we've never met. But if we were sisters or best friends, I still wouldn't know that about you.
Right. Well, and what is the influence of social media
It's huge.
to, I feel like it's hurting us more than it's helping us. And that's where people that are so angry are the loudest. And I feel like even though I go on there to like social media at the end of my day to watch like funny cat videos, I'm still hearing these negative messages, even though that's not my algorithm, right? Like that's not what I'm
It's fed
searching
to
out.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's because we have no public control over this stuff. Like, why is there no Canadian Twitter that just puts all the news in one place and you can subscribe or unsubscribe?
Yeah.
And it's regulated, it's not for profit, it's not torquing us to all be little fascists.
Right. And like, so what could we do? What is the everyday person?
Yeah.
What is this going to be in your next book? Some solutions or ideas
This
to this?
this is a topic of a book that has been rejected by every single Canadian publisher.
What?
Yeah. Oh no, I can't self-publish. I don't have time for that. Oh my God, it's hard enough to be published with an independent. Self-publishing would be even harder. Yeah, no, this is the fundamental question. Now, if we were to say, okay, let's lobby for a publicly owned social network, that's something we could do. That's something we totally could do. We could totally talk to politicians and say, actually, we want you to put money into a Canadian Twitter, right? And you don't control it. You just make it. You make the infrastructure.
But what, like, people already denounce things like the CBC.
Yeah.
And like the news is so hated.
Yeah.
No matter what information they're receiving, it's always lies.
Yeah, I mean, it's because the CBC sucks is the problem. You know, like, yeah, they don't help
But I mean, that's
themselves.
the government owned one, right? So if the government were to own anything else, it would be all, they're indoctrinating us, right?
It would be the argument, but if it was quality, I don't think it would stick. I think the reason why the CBC is in such trouble right now is because no one wants to listen to Ali Hassan featuring every single episode of every single show. No disrespect to him, but he's just like the host that's hosting everything, right? Like we have to not mix up the fact that people are confusing the CBC with the state, and the CBC is just sucking. You know, because like I think of like my conservative family that still listens to CBC that will quote back to me something that they've heard from David McDonald from the CCPA, and not like in scorn, like, oh, I've learned this thing from this economist, right? Because for them, they grew up listening to the CBC, and that's the only radio station that they can get. And that's for a lot of rural Canada. And if it was reflective and engaging and interesting, everything would be different.
True.
Right? So that's tough, right? So then it's like, okay, so we've got a couple of axes there. We've got maybe a publicly owned social network. Maybe we're talking about making the CBC not suck. Maybe there's public ownership of the internet, right? Maybe there's like, I don't know, funding culture in this country. We don't fund culture at all, right?
Well, how can we fund culture if we can't get an operation to save our life?
Well,
That's
this
just it,
is the
right?
profits. Then this goes back to the
That's
profits.
the argument,
Yeah.
right? That's what you would hear
Yeah.
by people.
And the answer is easy. You take money from the rich, and they're like, but then they'll leave Canada. And they're like, see ya.
Yeah.
That sounds great. And then it's
Agreed.
like, oh wait, they actually won't leave Canada because they do like the snow and want to hunt sometimes. Yeah.
And there's lots of freedom.
And there's lots of freedom. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you.
Who's coming next? Anybody? Yeah. All right.
So I'm deeply confused. I understand why everyone is pissed off about everything and everybody all the time. And I think, I heard you on Canada Land talking with Jesse about, the state of healthcare in the country, that we've slipped from 6 hospital beds per 1,000 people down to 2 per 1,000 people. And that, if we actually just funded Medicare appropriately, COVID would have still been a big deal, vaccines, social distancing, et cetera, masking, all would have still been really good things to do, but it would have been less dire, less urgent. Mm-hmm. And we see that in other areas. You've talked about housing, we see it in public education, where we have, if your kiddo is fine, they're gonna be fine. If your kiddo is struggling, they might get some extra help that they need, that they might not if they don't sing far enough, fast enough, or if they happen to be in a really high needs school. So there are all these things that are less good than they could be, and everyone's really pissed off. And so the solution is to elect Pierre Poilievre, or if we want to go south of the border, the Orange Cheeto.
Yeah.
Like, I don't understand how that is the knee-jerk reaction of so many people. Let's elect fascists. Let's elect people who yell a lot and have really simplistic slogans who actually don't have any solutions. And I mean, to be fair, I mean, if Justin Trudeau wasn't so lazy and actually did the work to support immigrants in the country, we might not be in the situation where we're slashing immigration. Now it was like, let's bring in people, but don't worry about the housing thing. Let's bring in people. Like, so why are we so keen to elect fascists instead of like actually people who would solve things? Like, why is that the impulse?
Yeah, so there's a lot of really interesting academic research that demonstrates that the neoliberal slide actually creates the conditions for electors to believe that fascist-like governments are the solution.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's like really bad news, but when you think of it from that perspective, then you remove the logic of you're voting against your own interest. Because people are not voting in a rational way like that. It is the economic conditions that make them want to oust the guy that's in power and get the guy that seems like he's most likely to be in power. And this is a huge fault of the NDP, because the NDP has played the same game. They think that they can be the Liberals. They can't out-Liberal the Liberals. And no one wants to see an NDP federal government that looks like a Liberal government. Not to mention, I mean, the NDP has zero game in Quebec, which is like kind of an important piece of how to win in this country. And so like, we have to be very clear to not confuse a default vote or a protest vote as being an intentional vote for Pierre Poilievre. Because, you know, Canadians are really basic people, and we keep going back to the Conservative Party because they are the natural party. And there's going to be a time limit to who stays in power. And the Liberals have kind of done everything wrong to make sure that they won't stay in power. And so then we get in a bit of a conundrum. Well, then who do you elect? Well, then becomes Pierre Poilievre. So thinking about this less from how can you be so stupid as to vote against your best interest, and understanding it as this is what the system leads the electorate to do, for me, it explains it a lot easier, and then it also gives me a path of action, which is, well, then we have to build some sort of alternative. We have to build an alternative partisan option, like for politics, but then we also have to build alternatives that the Conservatives won't mess with. And that is possible because the Conservatives, at the end of the day, still want to get elected.
Do you think, given what you've said, and it makes sense, do you think if we had managed, or more accurately, had Trudeau kept his promise on electoral reform, giving Canadians the ability to vote for what they want rather than voting against what they don't want, do you think we would be in a different situation?
100%. I think that electoral reform, I mean, the situation is bigger than just who we're electing. So I do want to make sure I say that. But I think that Canadians were very excited by electoral reform. Like I was at 2 or 3 electoral reform commission meetings, and it was wild to see how many average people were there talking about this. And it reminded me of in 2007, was anyone in 2007 in Ontario for that referendum? No, do you know what I'm talking about? No. So in 2007, Ontarians voted to change the electoral system. And the way that this happened was they created a citizens' assembly. They randomly selected a citizen from every riding who was perfectly representative in age and race and gender of the province. They gave them 6 weeks of free classes at Queen's University to learn all of these political systems, and the citizens' assembly recommended the best option. And that option was a mixed member proportional option. The province did not advertise it. It went to the vote it went to the population in a vote in election, and it died at 30% of the people voted for it. And it was our best shot at electoral reform in Ontario. And the citizens' assembly process was so fascinating because you literally had like bus drivers and school teachers become like champions of electoral reform. I remember going to a panel where these 3 previously completely uninterested Ontarians in the electoral system were there as the advocates that we need to change this. And so I know that that kind of thing is very exciting to people. And I think that the nail in Trudeau's coffin was when he abandoned it, because it was so flagrant. Like it was one of the promises that was just so flagrantly violated. And had the NDP put that into their sucking and blowing agreement with the Liberals, I think that it would have looked quite different. But the fact that they didn't is also kind of proof of how serious the NDP were actually to try to force the Liberals to do something. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Yeah, you stood up. Let's go.
Hello,
Hi.
I have two questions for you. The first is, as we head on our trajectory of chaos and devastation that you mentioned, unless we make some changes, what gives you hope? Is there anything?
Well, yeah, what gives me hope? No, I mean, I don't have the need to have hope. I'm a generally optimistic person, if you can believe it, which I mean must just sound ridiculous, because why would I be optimistic? I mean, my life's a nightmare. No, my life is awesome. Maybe that's why I have hope, is I have a great, like, luckily I'm very lucky to have kids that aren't too annoying and a partner who's rarely annoying, so it's like great. But you know, there is hope in a lot of really wonderful movements. Pretty much all of the movements for land back and civil rights and Indigenous self-determination, nationhood, that's all. I mean, I don't want to put on to those movements, you are our hope, because that's not fair. But the most radical, the most amazing, the most creative, the most wonderful work is being done there. And so that gives me not just hope, but like a roadmap, which I think is even more important than just like, you know, hope. But I also think that, like, you know, I know Canadian history, and I know that everyone always thinks that, you know, I mean, I know human history. Humans always think that they're the last people to live at any moment, right? Humans always think that the apocalypse is coming and they'll be assumed into heaven, or they'll be all mass dying or whatever, right? And sure, we're probably closer to that than anyone else, right? But that's also hubris talking too. So I don't get too wrapped up in fearing too much, because it's like this is the rhythm of the world, and I do have hope that humans can figure it out, because we have before. It's not a huge amount of hope. Like, I'm not betting money on it. But the sun's gonna come up in 12 hours or something. I don't know. I just made that up. I have no idea when the sun comes up. It's coming up tomorrow. We'll be warm. We'll be happy, and hopefully we'll be with people that we tolerate at worst, right? And there's always some piece of, there's always hope. Always. You know, you look at Gaza, where you're like, where's the hope there? You know? And people are still alive, right? Like, people are still alive, they're still fighting, they're still resisting, there's like right to the end, there's still hope. And the hope in the most dire situation on the planet is the hope that humanity will stop it. And that's still the hope we all have. No, and that is up to us, because we're not the ones underneath the bombs of Israel, right? So there's always hope. And if you're like, where's the hope? It's like, the sun's gonna rise. Yeah, it'll set too, but you don't want it up all night.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And my second question is, do you have like I'm a communicator, so this is very much a communications question. Do you have like a key message or sort of talking point, if you will, about how to explain to folks why neoliberalism is detrimental? Is there a summation of that might be helpful for folks who maybe are, you know, just learning about this kind of thing, the political structures, the history?
Yeah.
How do you start that conversation?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of different ways in, and it's like, you know, am I having a dinner party talk, or am I, you know, talking from the pulpit in church or whatever? Like, there's different ways to do that. I don't do that too much, but neoliberalism is simply, we have removed the guardrails on our economy and allowed people to become absolutely unthinkably rich. And to have done that, we had to deregulate, underfund, cut tax, all this stuff. We had to really get rid of all the collective structures within society, including our ability to organize, which is why it feels so difficult to organize right now. And so if we continue on this path, there will be more profits, there will be more suffering, there will be more divide between the rich and the poor, or we stop that and we do the opposite. It's as simple as that. I mean, neoliberalism is a difficult concept because it doesn't mean what it says, and I get that that's part of why it's so complicated. But it's like, it's the supremacy of the market. We have allowed the market to decide everything from where we get our medicine, to what we eat, to where we live. Does that make sense? And then someone says yes, and like, what the hell is wrong with you? And then you fight.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question if anybody has one.
Yeah, we
Oh,
got.
perfect.
Yeah. Where's the voice coming from? That was magic.
Hi Nora, I'm Joe.
Hi.
On my Facebook, I say you were my best friend, but you probably don't look at my Facebook very much.
Remember, and this, well, that's a good reminder, we don't know what we see on Facebook, because Facebook hides stuff from us.
I friended you. Anyway, I just have one question. I want you to unpack Canada's foreign policy.
That's the one question.
That's it.
Actually, you know what? It's a super easy answer right now. We don't have foreign policy. Like, at all. You know, I'm writing a feature right now for the Walrus on how do we how's the Canadian government count deaths in a war zone? And I asked them, how do we count deaths in a war zone? And what do you think they told me? Like, how would you, like, just imagine, it's government, foreign affairs, global affairs Canada. There's so Sudan is in civil war. We said we're gonna bring these refugees to Canada. We must have a concept of who's dying there. So how do we do it?
I would think you'd go to the UN
Yes.
experts who are actually on the ground, who are keeping track of what's actually going on.
Yeah, that's an answer. I mean, yeah, you would think that. They said to me, this is the official line from Global Affairs Canada. We don't. I was like, sorry, what the hell are you talking about? Of course you do. You must. No, we don't. And no further comment. Now I have it in defense, and so I talked to the Department of Defense. I'm like, okay, how do you do this? And he told me how they do it, which is of course classified. No, there's public channels, there's private channels, classified channels, and public channels include the UN, but more actually importantly includes groups like the Red Cross or Human Rights Watch or whatever. And so I start with answering a question by talking about that, because we really have no foreign policy anymore. It is fully what the United States says is our foreign policy. You know? And I'm reading, I have this wonderful book, Critical Essays in Canada, written in 1970. The essays are from 1964 to 1970. And the essay that I'm on right now, which I've read before, is George Grant's Lament for a Nation, which is, I think is really a wonderful reminder of where foreign policy discussions, where the foundation of them started in the 1960s. And Grant is a conservative, a real, like, God is good, I am in church every weekend conservative. And he is pissed that Pearson is celebrated as the universal internationalist man while bringing nuclear weapons to Canada, right? And this is like George Grant is the epitome of conservative. And he looks at the Liberals and the Liberal project and says, they are outsourcing our sovereignty and they are pretending to care about this continentalist man, our rights as Americans and Canadians in North America, and they destroyed Diefenbaker over his decision to not arm the Bomark missiles with nuclear warheads. And it's like, wow, they're thinking about foreign policy. Do you remember we had foreign policy in this country? We have nothing. And so, in the absence of any kind of coherent foreign policy, we have announcements that are made by the federal government the day after the exact same announcements made in the United States. And it is so bad that in part of my research interviews for the speecher, I talked to one person with an international NGO, and she said, we often are in parliamentary committees with more information than the MPs have.
I've had that experience talking to him.
Yeah, and they're on the committee. They're supposed to know that.
Yeah.
And she said, and it's like one thing for people to not know what's going on in, I don't know, country X. But it's another thing for the federal government to not know what's going on in country X when we literally have programs in that country because we've closed our embassies, we're not in the game of foreign affairs anymore. And I'll finish with this anecdote. I have a very good friend of mine who has a very high position in the government of Quebec. And I wish I could write about all of her stories. Actually, I'll tell you one of her stories, and this has nothing to do with anything. So one of her jobs is, this is so morbid. She approves extraordinary medical expenses. It's unbelievable. And there was a family that was flying to the United States from Vancouver, flew through Montreal. The mother dies on board and the family leaves. And so they leave to the United States. And so she becomes the property of the government of Quebec. What do you do? What do you do? Can you imagine the family? They just freaked. They just freaked and they left. So there, how's that for an anecdote? Okay, that had nothing to do with anything. I'm gonna write a story about that being the story because that's so crazy. So when Haiti, Canada has, or Quebec has 11 Haitian babies with Canadian citizenship. The government of Quebec is like, we need to get these babies out of Haiti because it's not safe. And Foreign Affairs was like, yeah. They're like, no, but you're doing evacuations, right? No. Canadian citizens, 30 years, 20 years ago, under Stephen Harper, it was never like this. The Liberals have really changed foreign affairs, and it's mostly, I think, amateur hour.
Yeah.
It's not political orientations, it's just amateur hour. So
Okay, thanks for that hopeful presentation.
Thank you so much, Nora.
how was that for story? Can you imagine that? You just leave your dead mother in Montreal because you freaked, you didn't know what to do? And then the flight attendants were like, and she was with people. They're in Ohio now. Anyway, that happened.
They left her on the plane.
They left her on the plane dead. Yeah. 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 They got a flight to catch. I mean, all you can chalk that up to is just like tremendous trauma, right? That's just, we'll deal with that.
For the flight attendant.
For everybody, except for the mom. Hopefully she had a good couple last minutes in here.
Thank you
What
so
did
much.
I start off with the morbid humor? We gotta laugh about death. What the hell? If we can't laugh about death, what's the point of dying?
Good end to the night. Thank you again, Nora, so much. We are going to move on to the signing portion of the evening. So please feel free to have your book signed before going to the cash desk. So long as you pay for the book, we're okay with it. And the signing will be right over here to my right, and you can line up just right along the wall here. Again, thank you so much for Dundurn Press for publishing this book. Thank you to all of you for your questions and for being here. And lastly, again, thank you so much, Nora Loreto.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful night, everyone.
And he's changing this right here.